Hello, friends. This is our second lecture on Congress and the legislative process, or legislative processes. And let me just say up front that I think Congress is at the center of the American political tradition, as does more political scientists than myself. I'd say the majority of American political scientists see Congress as the fundamental institution, although many political scientists study the presidency, many study the Supreme Court. But Congress is unique. It is often called the first branch. And by first branch, we mean the one that the founders intended to be the most important, to be central, to be the most vital, where most of the decisions would be made. Now think about for a moment why the founders might have had that view. Why would they have thought of Congress as being the first branch? Well, it is definitely closer to the people. Representatives come from the states, senators come from the states. They were originally elected by the state legislature, but the 17th Amendment in the 20th century, we begin to elect senators as we do today directly by state. So they're much closer to the citizens. Also more of them. They're more deliberative. You have in the 21st century 435 members of the House of Representatives, and you have 100 in the Senate. And we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. So many times Congress is described as the first branch. It's mentioned first in the Constitution. Its duties are much longer than the president's or the Supreme Court's per the Constitution. Take a look at Article 1. Article 1 is really, really impressive because it outlines all the powers of Congress. Okay, in reality, Congress may not always be the most powerful institution. It is always the largest. It has the greatest potential power, but in the second half of the 20th century, in the 21st century, the presidency has exerted a great deal of force, and not just in terms of the use of the military and other kinds of police powers, but also in terms of just making laws. So what Congress's fundamental duty to make laws has been challenged in some way by the presidency, but the Congress is still the institution where laws are made. In many ways, the president may propose, but it is Congress that disposes. It's Congress that actually makes the decision. So we still refer to Congress in many ways as the first branch because that's certainly the idea that the American founders thought they should hold, that they should be the most important branch. And so we're going to spend our lecture today just introducing the institution of Congress to us and becoming familiar with it, and about just a sort of rudimentary, what are we talking about Congress? Who is part of Congress? What are Congress's rules? And these kinds of issues, just basic introduction. Well, the U.S. Congress meets in the U.S. Capitol, of course, that is located on an area called Jenkins Hill, kind of a high ridge in D.C., and it is really the center of the American political system. I hope you have the chance to visit Congress. Visit the houses on one side, the Senate is on the other. They're connected by a rotunda area. It's a very beautiful aspect of American architectural life. Now, I will try to be as unbiased as possible, but as a former employee of the U.S. House of Representatives, I tend to really especially like the House, although the subject of a number of my books has been related to the Senate. So I also have a great fondness for the Senate as well. Okay, let's talk about the differences between the two bodies in the most basic sense. The House, 435 members. That has been a consistent number for quite some time. In the House, as you'll notice from reading Article 1, the minimum age is 25, which would actually have been middle-aged person in 1789. Today, it's a very young person. They're there are very few people in their 20s in the U.S. House. In fact, it's kind of a novelty for someone to be that young. You also have to have lived in the United States for a period of time. You could be born in another country, but you have to have been a citizen of the United States for a period of time before running for office. On the other hand, in the United States Senate, you have to be 30. Now, we'll see later, there's a 35-year-old age requirement to run for president. The Senate is very different. We elect 2 per state, and so we have 50 states, 100 senators. We have a rotational cycle where every 2 years, a third of the U.S. Senate is up for election. The antithesis of the House, where every member of the House is running for re-election every 2 years. And members of the House obviously are much closer to their constituents, the citizens in their respective districts in the House versus the state. And for a United States Senator, their constituents are throughout the state. They represent all the citizens of the state. And the environments themselves are really, really very different. In the House, you can drown in your own obscurity. It's much slower in terms of developing and becoming known as a political force and a powerhouse legislature in the United States House of Representatives. More competition and more of you. You tend to represent more local interests, even within a state. On the other hand, in the United States Senate, you are a prima donna the day you arrive. Because unlike the House that has more of a seniority system, you build your way up the longer you're there, in the Senate, you are an equal the day you arrive, the day that you show up to take office and you take office. In my mind, the U.S. Senate is the world's most elite club. Now, there are many elite clubs. Now, once in a while, my wife and I will travel, and our daughter, who travels a great deal, says, you guys ought to go into one of those frequent flyer clubs that you see in the airport. You know, you have free libations, free internet connection, all those kinds of things you usually don't find in an airport. And because she travels a lot, she's a member of one of those groups. I've never been in one of those rooms because you can tell that the folks that are members of those clubs think they're part of an elite group. They really have nothing on the U.S. Senate. The U.S. Senate is, in many ways, the most elite club in the world. A great deal of power, a great deal of responsibility, and there are only 100 of you. In the House, as I mentioned, you can drown in your own obscurity, 435. You usually have a group of people that you work with very closely. You probably know everyone in the House. I mean, 435 is not totally unmanageable, but there may be some people you do not know very well. But basically, you're unknown to the American public unless you're a committee chair or a prominent member or just sort of a wild man or a wild woman. The Senate, on the other hand, you're a celebrity. You're one of 100. I would encourage you to take a moment and look at C-SPAN 1 and C-SPAN 2. C-SPAN 1, the network, great network, the cable company's gift to the American people. C-SPAN 1 covers the House, C-SPAN 2 covers the Senate. Anytime they're in session, they're covered on and they're broadcast on C-SPAN. There's also C-SPAN 3. I think that's the best 3 networks you can possibly watch. Who cares about Oxygen, ESPN, ABC, NBC, CBS? Just watch C-SPAN. It'll change your life. And of course, I'm very biased. Okay, so in terms of practical work in the 2 bodies, if you are a member of the House, you may not have the opportunity to speak on every piece of legislation that comes before the House. People have more seniority than you, perhaps. They also have more knowledge, and so you have to work your way up. And the structure of the House, because there are more people, 435, it's very limited in terms of the amount of time a member can, especially a new member, can speak. The Senate is the opposite. Again, you're an equal the day you arrive. The Senate, as its rules generally allow a senator to speak anytime he or she wants. Very, very different from the House. A much different environment. And that's important to keep in mind when we look at the two bodies. Another topic that we should consider is the notion of seniority. Both the House and the Senate, but especially the House, follow a system of seniority. The longer you're in a particular position, the more are on a particular committee, the more you advance. But you can advance in other ways. For example, you could be elected Speaker, which is unlikely, but you could be elected Speaker and not have been in the House but a decade or so, perhaps. That's still somewhat unlikely. But they follow basically a system of seniority for appointments in the House and in the Senate. This is very important. It's changed a lot since the Gingrich speakership of the 1990s, but it's still much in play. Another issue that's not talked about, one of the most interesting aspects of the Congress, because it is a deliberative body, it is representative of the American people, is the notion of decorum, which, by the way, is a fancy word that you can use to win friends and influence people. Decorum is a listening, sharing other members' perspectives while not insulting them and not personally attacking them. Now, there have been examples of this in the 19th century. There's a chap who was caned in Congress, but this is very unusual. And if you do break these rules of decorum, you could be punished by the House or the Senate, and generally your colleagues will think less of you. So debate in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate is typically very, very amicable and friendly, even though people may have great differences in terms of their views. They tend to work together personally. When I was working in the United States House of Representatives in 1982, there was a member of Congress, a very young member of Congress, who criticized the sitting speaker, Thomas P. Tip O'Neill. Democrats were in control of the U.S. House. O'Neill was the Democratic speaker, very large man, sort of a giant of a man with perpetual bourbon suntan, a great speaker, powerful figure. This young member of Congress from the other party, the minority party, got mad at the speaker and the speaker promoting a certain budget proposal. And on the floor of the House, he said, "Speaker O'Neill, you're big, fat, and out of control, just like the budget." Well, that was against the rules of decorum. Everybody knew it. O'Neill never responded, but he went into that House member's district and raised money for his opponent, lots of money for his opponent. And that was that member's last and also his first term in the U.S. House. Again, the rules of decorum are part of how the U.S. Congress operates and are very important to recognize and to pay attention to those rules. We're also going to talk about in the next lecture, the committee system in Congress, as well as the leadership, and then we're going to look at how a bill becomes a law. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.